The warlord's first mistake was paying a buttload worth of silver for bad intelligence. His second mistake was parking his overpriced shitbox ship on the old man's corn. A Skarn Marauder-class skiff, a contraption that looked less engineered and more coughed up by a scrap metal behemoth, descended upon the cornfield with the acoustic and aerodynamic grace of a falling dumpster. Its anti-grav plates, whining a discordant symphony of protest, finally surrendered to physics and slammed the hull into the rich topsoil. The impact crushed 24 rows of meticulously cultivated, gene-tailored corn, each stalk a testament to a decade of patient agriculture. The sound of it, a wet, violent crunch, was obscene in the morning quiet. From the wreckage of his landing, Drazkor the Undying stepped onto the soil, his ornate mag boots sinking into the dirt with an infuriating squelch. He was flanked by a retinue of his personal butchers, the Bone Eaters, their plasma carbines held at a low ready. That broadcasted a disgusting amount of arrogance. Above them, 3 colossal dreadnoughts tore holes in the sky, their jagged silhouettes a promise of casual, overwhelming annihilation. They drifted in low orbit like a panel of judges who had already decided on the death penalty. Drazkor's lieutenant, a hulking brute named Gentano, whose face looked like it had been used to tenderize meat, gestured a clawed hand toward the heavens. "Glorious warlord," Gentano rumbled, his voice a gravelly avalanche honed by years of bellowing across noisy engine rooms. "The fleet is in its orbital perch. A single whisper from you and our lances will turn this entire continent to glass. We could be celebrating your victory 3 systems away before the fallout even settles." Drazkor offered a sneer, a theatrical twisting of his thin lips that was meant to convey menace, but landed closer to indigestion. He scanned the humble homestead, the weathered farmhouse, the sturdy barn, the lonely silo that stood like a silent guardian over a sea of green. It was a portrait of such pathetic agrarian tranquility, it made his teeth itch. 2 decades of hunting, he said, his voice a low, theatrical growl he'd honed in front of countless reflective bulkheads. 20 years of sifting through lies, chasing phantoms and bribing every data clerk from here to the core. A spineless concordance activist finally sold me the deed to this mudball. He kicked a clod of dirt, soiling his immaculate boot. "No, Gentano, this is not a matter for orbital bombardment. This is a privilege. My privilege." His self-importance was a palpable force, a gravity well of ego that bent the wills of the men around him. The fleet was his kingdom, the instrument of his power, but this was an intimate affair. He had come for Hector, the man who'd turned their invincible armada into a constellation of funeral pyres with a single elegant equation. He expected a broken, haunted shell of a man, drowning in memories he couldn't outrun. This was never going to be a battle. It was a long overdue execution, a performance piece for an audience of one. An hour earlier, the system's primary star had just begun its climb over the jagged purple hills, its light spilling across the valley in long, gentle strokes. Hector stood among his corn, the stalks towering over him, their green leaves rustling in the breeze. He silently inspected the high-pressure irrigation system, a complex web of pipes and regulators he'd built with his own 2 hands. His hands, maps of scars from 2 violently different lives, moved with a steady economy born of 1,000 repetitions. He found a loose valve, its seal weeping a single precious bead of water. A quarter turn from a pocket tool fixed the leak. The dripping stopped. He nodded once, a gesture of deep satisfaction. The universe, in this one small specific way, was back in its proper order. Across the yard, a vibrant and highly creative stream of profanity sliced through the morning calm. Harriet wrestled with the magneto winch on their utility vehicle, a 6-wheeled beast of burden she'd christened the Mule. "Damn this heap of bolts and broken dreams," she grunted. She punctuated the insult by kicking the winch's housing with her steel-toed boot, producing a dull clang. a slack of dog-eared engineering manuals with titles like Applied Field Mechanics and High Voltage Systems for the Terminally Optimistic sat on the fender beside her. The jury-rigged power conduit she'd spliced into the winch, its casing cracked and frayed like an old rope, spat a volley of angry blue sparks in protest. "Dad, the magnetic clutch is slipping again. It's got all the gripping power of a politician's apology." Hector looked over, his weathered face an unreadable landscape of sun-etched lines. He saw his daughter, her cheeks smudged with grease, her fiery red hair wrangled into a chaotic knot. She was the only part of his life that wasn't a ghost, the only thing he'd managed to build instead of break. She rolled her eyes and threw her hands up in a gesture of absolute surrender. "Fine, fine, I'll get the persuader." She stomped off toward the cellar, her boots kicking up dust. "And while I'm down there, I'll grease the hinges on this blast door you call an entrance. Seriously, who builds a storm cellar rated to withstand a direct meteor strike? Were the previous owners worried about kaiju?" Hector watched her go. For a brief moment, a deep, familiar sorrow surfaced in his gaze, a phantom limb of a life he'd amputated long ago. "It's sturdy," he murmured to the rustling corn, the words a secret the wind carried away. Drascor's bone eaters swaggered toward the farmhouse, their armor clanking a rhythm of unearned confidence. They saw Hector, an old man in dusty overalls who looked as if he'd sprouted from the soil himself, and they saw Harriet, emerging from the dark, cool maw of the cellar, a heavy industrial-grade torque wrench clutched in her hand. Drascor stepped forward, positioning himself in the center of the yard, bathing in the imagined spotlight of his moment. He was the avenging angel, the protagonist of his own grand, tragic opera. He launched into the speech he had rehearsed in the cold, silent dark between star systems for 2 decades. "Hector," he began, his amplified voice echoing slightly in the open air, "I was there, on the spire of Cathar, a boy, a junior communications ensign. I watched the command screen as your face, emptied of everything but command, gave the order. I saw the sky itself catch fire because of you. Cities of glass and light, monuments to 1,000 years of peace, crumble into ash and memory because of you." He paused dramatically, anticipating fear, begging, or at the very least a flicker of recognition for his soliloquy. Instead, Harriet leaned against a fence post, casually wiping grease from her hands with a rag she'd produced from a back pocket. She squinted at the armored scarn, then at their ridiculously overcompensating warships polluting her sky. "You boys look a little overdressed for the Harvest Festival," she said, her voice dripping with a carefully cultivated frontier mockery. "Get lost on the way to the Galactic LARPing Convention? The official scrapyard is 2 systems over, though judging by that flying garbage scow you landed in, you might have already found it." A few of the bone eaters let out strangled chuckles, a breach of discipline that was instantly crushed by a glare from Gantano. Righteous, poetic fury curdled into raw, sputtering ego on Drascor's face. The script had been violated. The scene was ruined. "Grab the girl," he snarled, all pretense of grandeur dissolving into the raw viciousness of a common street thug. "She will learn some respect for her father's victims." The instant a raider's gauntleted hand touched Harriet's arm, the universe, which Hector had so painstakingly put in order, came completely unglued. Target acquisition. Hostile. Close quarters. Threat to asset. Critical. Sanctioning lethal response. The old farmer vanished. The general awoke. With a single fluid motion that was a violent contradiction to his age, Hector snatched a nearby pitchfork from where it leaned against the fence. It was a simple tool, balanced for tossing hay and aerating compost. In his hands, it became an instrument of war. He didn't just throw it, he launched it from the hip. It flew without a whisper, a silent, 3-pronged missile. It crossed the 10 feet of open ground in less than a heartbeat, its sharpened tines finding the unarmored gap beneath the raider's helmet. The tines punched through the gorget's flexible seal and buried themselves deep in the scarn's throat. The raider looked down at the wooden handle protruding from his neck, a a comical expression of profound surprise on his alien features, before collapsing like a marionette whose strings had been severed. As the first body thudded onto the dirt, Harriet reacted. Her mind didn't see a life-or-death threat. It saw a problem in applied engineering. She saw the raider lunging for her, and she saw the sparking, frayed power conduit for the winch just inches from her boot. She thought in schematics. With the heavy wrench still gripped in her fist, she didn't swing it as a club. That was inefficient. She used it as leverage to rip the metal access panel clean off the winch's housing, exposing the primary terminals, thick copper bus bars humming with a lethal amount of latent power. In a single desperate and utterly brilliant motion, she jammed the heavy steel wrench across the terminals. A dead short. A sun-white arc of amperage erupted with a sound like God tearing sheet metal. The current, a captive lightning bolt seeking the path of least resistance, surged up the winch's steel cable. The two Skarn holding it convulsed, their bodies locking rigid as thousands of amps flash-cooked their internal systems. They dropped like stones, twitching and smoking, the air suddenly thick with the smell of flash-fried alien biology and vaporized insulation. The encounter shred any pretense of being a firefight. It became a harvest. The illusion of an easy target was atomized in under 3 seconds. The quiet farm erupted into a cacophony of plasma bolts and some creatively hazardous agriculture. Hector and Harriet worked in a perfect unspoken synchronization forged over years of chores that were, in reality, a litany of brutal training exercises disguised as farm maintenance. 9 hostiles remain, 3 left flank, 4 center, 2 high ground on the skiff, environmental assets, irrigation system, thresher, livestock pens, the mule. His mind processed the battlefield with the cold, detached velocity of a combat computer. A Skarn raised his rifle. Hector was already in motion. He spun on his heel, his boot lashing out, not at the raider, but at the main valve of the high-pressure irrigation system. He kicked it open. A jet of water, focused by a cutting nozzle designed for clearing rock slides, erupted from the pipe at 300 pounds per square inch. The stream hit the Skarn's chest with the kinetic force of a cannonball, lifting him clean off his feet and slamming him against the side of the barn with a wet, bone-shattering crunch. He slid to the ground, a broken, sodden heap. Harriet, who had scrambled onto the barn's corrugated metal roof with the sure-footed speed of someone who'd spent her childhood chasing escaped chickens up there, had already unspooled the now de-electrified winch cable. Using the manual crank, she let the cable drop, a pendulum of heavy steel. She lassoed another raider by the ankle. Before he could even register the strange tug, she slammed the winch motor into reverse. The motor shrieked in protest, and the raider was hoisted into the air, upside down and screaming, spinning helplessly like a grotesque fishing lure. Hector, meanwhile, had reached the massive 6-wheeled crop thresher parked beside the barn. It was a behemoth of stained metal and brutalist engineering, a machine that perpetually smelled of diesel, hot steel, and chlorophyll. He didn't have the keys, he didn't need them. He ripped open a side panel, his fingers finding the ignition wires by touch alone, a familiar caress. He stripped their insulation with his teeth and twisted the bare ends together. The thresher, which Harriet had nicknamed the Beast, bellowed to life with a belch of greasy black smoke and the clatter of a dozen angry gods trapped in a gearbox. Its massive cutting blades began to spin with a hungry metallic whir. Hector slammed it into gear and sent it rolling, an unmanned multi-ton juggernaut of agricultural death, toward a group of 4 raiders who were attempting to establish a firing line behind their crippled skiff. They saw the roaring, smoke-belching monster bearing down on them, its spinning blades glinting in the morning sun. Their disciplined military formation dissolved into pure primal panic. They scattered like startled birds, their plasma bolts ricocheting harmlessly off its reinforced, manure-caked chassis. While the beast herded the terrified Skarn, Hector had vaulted into the driver's seat of the mule. He gunned the engine, and the utility vehicle roared in response. He didn't try to outmaneuver the enemy skiff, he aimed directly for its center of mass. The mule, equipped with a solid wedge of sharpened steel, an armored plow for clearing felled megafauna from logging trails, hit the lightly armored raider skiff like a freight train. The plow bit deep, shearing the vehicle clean in two. The skiff's power core, breached and catastrophically unstable, detonated in a blinding flash of blue-white energy. The explosion sent shrapnel, twisted metal, and miscellaneous body parts flying in every direction. It was over. Most of the raiders were dead or incapacitated. A new silence fell over the farm, broken only by the crackling of the burning skiff and the pained, gurgling groans of the dying. Drazkor, his face now bleeding from a fresh gash on his cheek where a piece of shrapnel had kissed him, stared in utter, slack-jawed disbelief. The brutal, terrifying economy of action, the way the old man moved, flowing from one act of violence to the next with no wasted energy. This wasn't the work of a retired officer rusting away on a farm. This was the work of a demon conjured from the old war stories. He looked at the farmer, who now stood amidst the wreckage, covered in dirt, grease, and the dark, viscous blood of Drazkor's men. His eyes were cold and ancient, pits of glacial ice that promised nothing but a swift, merciless, and deeply personal end. And in that moment, Drazkor finally saw him. The name from the archives was Hector, but the creature standing before him, the thing that had turned a peaceful farm into a slaughterhouse in less than 5 minutes, was the living embodiment of the terrifying myth his people whispered about in the dark. A monster that didn't just win wars, but erased civilizations. "The Reaper," Drazkor whispered, the name spoken not as an accusation, but with a dawning soul-deep horror that froze the blood in his veins. Gentano, his last surviving guard, heard the name. The color drained from his rugged face. The legends were true. The monster was real. He dropped his rifle and simply ran, screaming a high, thin wail of undiluted, bladder-loosening terror as he fled into the depths of the cornfield. Consumed by a toxic cocktail of public humiliation and murderous mania, Drazkor scrambled for a damaged speeder bike that had been flung from the wreckage. He managed to get it sputtering to life and rocketed away, screaming a promise of fiery, absolute retribution back at the silent figure standing in the smoke.
"You'll burn for this, you gutless worm! I'll rain fire from the heavens! I will unmake everything you have ever loved!"
The old man just watched him go, his expression as unchanging. An hour later, the smoke had mostly cleared, but the coppery tang of blood and the sharp scent of flash-burned electronics saturated the air. The bodies had been dragged to a ditch at the edge of the property, out of sight but not out of mind. Hector was in the kitchen, wordlessly patching a plasma burn on Harriet's upper arm. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his fingers moving with an unnerving steadiness, cleaning the wound and applying the synth skin with no wasted motion. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a grim, heavy stillness in its wake. He finished the bandage and then inspected her combat stance as she stood, his expression all discipline and silence. "Did you run the targeting diagnostics on the pest rifle this week?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. It was a systems check. Harriet didn't miss a beat. Her usual sarcasm was a thin, brittle shield over her own frayed nerves. "Twice," she replied, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. "Recalibrated the particle focus and cleaned the magnetic coils. Don't worry, old man. I can still outshoot you." He gave a short, sharp nod, the closest he ever came to a smile of approval. "Good," he said, before turning to survey the horizon, his eyes scanning the clear blue sky. "He'll be back." The brief exchange confirmed a lifetime of suspicion for Harriet. Sighting the pest rifle for crop-eating and rad gophers was sniper training. Recalibrating the electric fences that kept the megafauna out was demolitions practice. Fixing the beast's perpetually jammed harvester blades was armored vehicle maintenance. Their entire life had been a quiet, relentless preparation for a war he had prayed would never find them. That night the sky burned. Aboard his flagship, Drazkor watched the replay of his humiliation on the main view screen, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his command chair. "Warlord?" An officer called from the sensor station, his voice tight with alarm. "Long-range sensors just flagged a Concordance patrol vessel dropping out of hyperspace at the system's edge. They've hailed us, demanding our identification." Draskor slammed his fist on the console.
How close?
"Too far to interfere directly, but they've seen our fleet mast in low orbit. They know we're here. We have minutes, maybe less, before their report brings a battle group down on our heads." Pure, undiluted fury contorted Draskor's features. His grand personal vengeance was being interrupted by bureaucratic gnats. He wouldn't get to savor the kill. He wouldn't get to watch Hector break, but he could still break his word.
Target the structures. All of them.
Draskor screamed, his voice cracking with petulant rage.
Burn it! Burn it all to the ground! Now! Then get us out of here!
His tantrum, a galaxy-sized burst of bruised ego, rained down from the sky. The bombardment was not the slow psychological torture he had envisioned. It was a frantic, rushed act of vandalism. The first volley of plasma lances hit the farmhouse, obliterating it in a silent, blinding flash of superheated gas. A moment later, the barn imploded. Then, haphazardly, orbital beams scoured the fields, turning a season's hard work into black, smoking ash. It was sloppy, it was incomplete, and it gave them a chance. They fought back from pre-prepared defensive positions. A network of reinforced trenches and foxholes Hector had dug years ago under the guise of an expanded irrigation project, but it was like trying to fight a hurricane with a handgun. A missile, intended for the now non-existent barn, strayed from its path. It struck the edge of their trench. The shockwave slammed into Harriet, a giant's invisible fist that lifted her off her feet and threw her against a wall of farming equipment stacked for cover. She cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pure pain. A piece of jagged metal shrapnel from a shattered plowshare, white-hot from the explosion, had torn through her non-dominant shoulder, leaving a deep bleeding wound that sizzled at the edges. The pain was a white-hot nova behind her eyes. Her left arm went numb, hanging uselessly at her side. The roof of the farmhouse, or what remained of it, finally gave way. It collapsed into the inferno with a deafening roar that sent a column of embers spiraling into the night sky like angry fireflies. The fight was lost. The farm was gone. Hector, battered and bruised, his overalls scorched and smoking, found Harriet trying to push herself up, her rifle still clutched in her good hand. Her face was pale from blood loss. Her teeth gritted against the agony that radiated from her shoulder. "I can still fight," she gasped, the words a defiant whisper against the roar of the flames. Seeing her like this, bleeding, broken, so close to death, all because of a war he had dragged to her doorstep, shattered something deep inside him. The farmer's stoicism, the general's icy control, it all fractured. A cold, familiar fury that had once shattered worlds rose to take its place. With a roar of pure anguish and rage that was more animal than human, he scooped her up into his arms. He carried her out of the burning wreckage of their lives, retreating into the one place on the farm Draskor couldn't see, the one place he didn't know existed, the reinforced cellar, hidden beneath the foundation of the old forgotten silo, the one with the door built to withstand a direct hit from a city killer. Inside the cellar, the air was cool and still. Hector laid Harriet down gently on a dusty cot. This was no storm cellar. The air smelled of old metal, dormant lubricants, and the faint, sterile scent of filtered air that hadn't been breathed in a generation. He walked to a rusted panel on the far wall, a panel that looked like an old fuse box. He didn't pry it open. He slammed his palm against it in a specific spot, a coded knock. With a deep hiss of ancient hydraulics and the groan of metal seals parting for the first time in 2 decades, the true nature of the room revealed itself. The false wall slid away, exposing a sealed military vault. Emergency lights flickered on, casting long dancing shadows over racks of Concordance marine armor, pulse rifles gleaming with cosmoline, cases of ammunition and medical supplies. At the center of the vault, sitting dormant in its maintenance cradle like a sleeping god of war, was a hulking olive-drab exosuit, a Mark IV Juggernaut siege suit. In the corner, a single armored cable snaked from the wall to the suit's maintenance port, connected to a trickle charger that hummed with a low, steady purpose. It was a tiny, constant lifeline he'd installed years ago, a paranoid modification siphoning a sliver of power from the farm's main geothermal generator, keeping the Juggernaut's core reactor from going completely cold. Harriet's eyes, wide with a mixture of pain and sheer awe, followed her father. The blast door, the trenches, the pest rifle, that was actually a military-grade particle beam weapon. It all clicked into a terrifying, perfect whole. Hector looked at the vault's contents, his expression heavy with resignation. It was the Concordance's unofficial, off-the-books retirement gift. A final act of loyalty from the men who served under him, the men of the 7th Scythe Division, a secret they had all taken to their graves. He stripped off his scorched farmer's overalls, revealing the gray, form-fitting biosuit he wore underneath at all times. He began the methodical, ingrained process of strapping into the machine. The quiet farmer was gone. The Reaper had come to collect. Hector sealed himself inside the cockpit. The canopy hissed shut, entombing him in plasteel and wiring. He slammed the primary power coupling into its socket. This was not a smooth, high-tech activation sequence. The Juggernaut groaned to life with the shriek of aging hydraulics and the acrid smell of ozone as capacitors, dormant for 20 years, charged with a deafening electric hum. A diagnostic screen flickered, a mix of amber and red error messages scrolling across its dead pixel-littered display. System offline. Weapons control hydraulic pressure low. Left actuator warning. Reactor shielding at 87%. Hector's hands moved over the auxiliary control in a blur. His right hand slammed a row of thick, clunky circuit breakers home while his left thumbed a diagnostic override on a cracked subscreen, manually bypassing fried circuits and rerouting power from non-essential systems to the primary motor functions. The automated starter was dead, its ignition sequence a string of corrupted code. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed a T-bar crank, set into the dashboard, a manual override for just such an occasion. With a grunt of raw, physical effort, he forced the engine to turn over. The suit was a barely functional relic, a museum piece from a more brutal era of warfare. Only a man who knew its every flaw, its every shortcut, its every ghost in the machine could make it walk. He ignored the screaming warnings, forced the machine to its feet with a jolt that rattled his teeth. Its heavy metallic footsteps echoed like doom in the confined space of the vault. He was no longer a man. He was a 10-ton instrument of wrath clad in rust and fury. The main silo doors, thick sheets of reinforced steel, didn't open. They exploded outward, ripped from their hinges by 10 tons of angry machinery. Hector, encased in the Juggernaut, burst into the fiery night. Drazkor's men who had landed and were now busy looting the ruins for anything of value turned in shock. Their casual cruelty twisted into sudden, wide-eyed terror. The massacre began. 50 hostiles, no cover, open field, advantage, Juggernaut. Objective, total annihilation. The cockpit filled with the smell of burning wires as Hector pushed the ancient suit far past its operational limits. He targeted the largest group first. The shoulder-mounted rocket pod, thankfully, still worked. A volley of mini-missiles turned a squad of Skarn into a cloud of pink mist and smoking craters. He advanced, each footstep a miniature earthquake. A hydraulic line in the suit's left arm, the one the diagnostics had warned him about, finally burst. Hot, viscous liquid sprayed across the inside of the canopy, partially obscuring his vision. He ignored it, switching his targeting display to infrared. The main chain gun spun up, its deafening roar drowning out the screams of his victims. He swept it across the field, cutting down Skarn as they tried to run for cover. He saw a heavy weapons team setting up an anti-armor laser. He charged. The grenade launcher, however, failed to come online. A red light blinked, ammo feed jam. He didn't have time to run a diagnostic. He smashed his gauntleted fist against the manual circuit breaker on his console. A shower of sparks erupted. A jolt of feedback made his arm go numb, and the blinking red light turned green. A single high-explosive grenade arced through the air, obliterating the laser team. The technology was failing. The armor was compromised. The suit was dying. But the man inside was a whirlwind of methodical, terrifying, and beautifully efficient destruction. Back in the vault, Harriet had found a military-grade medkit. She worked with the detached focus of a mechanic repairing a complex machine. She cleaned her wound, packed it with a coagulant gauze, and, gritting her teeth against the searing pain, injected a powerful stimulant and broad-spectrum painkiller directly into her thigh. The world, which had been swimming in and out of focus, sharpened. The pain receded to a dull, manageable throb. She crawled to the cellar entrance, dragging the heavy-duty K7 particle lance, the pest control, with her. She braced the heavy weapon on the broken concrete frame of the entrance, using her body weight and her one good arm to steady its immense bulk. Through the high-powered scope, she became her father's overwatch. She saw him, the Juggernaut, a walking tank carving a path of ruin through the raiders, and she saw the threats he missed. A Skarn specialist, cloaked in a stealth field, was trying to get a lock on the Juggernaut's exposed reactor housing with a shoulder-fired plasma lance. He was almost invisible to the naked eye, a faint shimmer in the air. But through the rifle's multi-spectrum scope, he glowed like a phantom. Harriet took a breath, let it out slow, and squeezed the trigger. There was no bang, only a sharp electric crackle. The particle beam, a lance of pure, coherent energy, shot through the night, invisible and silent. The Skarn specialist's head vaporized in an instant. His body stood for a second before collapsing. "Got your back, old man," she muttered, blood dripping from her lip where she'd bitten it. She lined up her next shot. Drazkor, watching his entire warband get systematically annihilated from his command position near the burning house, finally strode over. He was encased in his own power armor, a sleek, custom-built suit that gleamed under the firelight, a marvel of aerodynamic plates and glowing energy conduits, a piece of military art next to the Juggernaut's brutalist functionality. In his hand, he held up a detonator. "The Butcher of Cathar!" he screamed over the din of battle, his voice amplified by his helmet's external speakers. "Still hiding in your metal shell, just like you hid behind your armies. Your butcher's work is done," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "I was a boy when I watched my world burn, Hector. Now you get to be the old man who watches his. I will take my time with her, and the last thing you will hear will be her screaming your name, just like I screamed for my father." The taunt worked. It was a stupid, emotional, villainous mistake. Hector charged. The failing Juggernaut groaned in protest, alarms blaring a symphony of mechanical agony. What unfolded was a graceless, shuddering brawl. They crashed through the burned-out skeleton of what had once been the farmhouse kitchen. Drazkor was faster, more agile. He danced around the lumbering Juggernaut, his high-frequency energy whip cracking through the air, slicing deep gouges into the Juggernaut's thick armor plates. Sparks flew like fireworks. Alarms screamed inside the cockpit. Hector ignored the damage. He wasn't trying to outfence him. He tackled him. The two armored figures, one sleek and modern, one old and brutal, crashed through a wall and into the mud outside. Drazkor, enraged at this primitive, undignified tactic, abandoned his range superiority. He wanted this to be personal. He wanted to feel Hector's armor buckle under his fists. They brawled in the mud and melted linoleum, trading blows that would have leveled a small building. Drazkor got the upper hand, his superior suit overpowering the Juggernaut's failing systems. He pinned the older man and drew a vibro knife, holding its humming blade to the Juggernaut's cockpit canopy. But inside the suit, Hector was smiling a grim, bloody smile. He was always a dirty fighter. With a final, desperate command, he blew the explosive bolts on his cockpit. The canopy shot off, and Hector ejected from the now crippled suit. He landed in the mud, out of the armor. It was just them now, two men covered in mud and rage. Drazkor, momentarily stunned, recovered quickly. He was still in his power armor. Hector was just an old man in a biosuit. He lunged, but Hector was faster. He smashed his forehead into Drazkor's faceplate, cracking the plasteel. He bit the gauntleted hand that held the knife, his teeth grinding on metal, and with his other hand, he activated a hidden blade in the heel of his boot. He kicked backwards, the monomolecular blade severing the power cables in Drazkor's hamstring actuator. Drazkor stumbled back, his leg giving out, screaming in fury and surprise. It was the opening Hector needed. He lunged, not at Drazkor's head or chest, but at his legs. He drove him backwards, step by staggering step, toward the still-spinning red-hot blades of the ruined crop thresher. With a final desperate shove, Hector pushed him headfirst into the machine. The fight ended in a final sickening spray of gore and shredded metal. Hector, bleeding from a dozen cuts and burns, stumbled back towards the silo. The adrenaline was leaving him, and the pain was setting in. He found Harriet there, slumped against the entrance, her particle rifle resting beside her. He collapsed to his knees beside her as the first rays of the planet's twin suns began to rise, casting a soft, gentle light over the smoldering ruins of their home. The fires were dying down. The only sounds were the wind whispering through the ashes and their own ragged, painful breaths. The adrenaline faded completely, and Hector's hands began to shake uncontrollably. His eyes darted across the horizon, reflexively, obsessively scanning for threats that were no longer there. The general was still in control. Harriet reached out with her good hand and placed it over his trembling one. Her touch was warm, solid, grounding. It was real. "Dad," she whispered, her voice rough. He looked at her, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the general in his eyes receded, leaving only the father. He was just an old man, tired and hurting. He reached out and touched the grim skull insignia painted on his discarded, battle-scarred juggernaut helmet, a symbol of life he thought he had buried. "You're not him," Harriet said, her voice firm, unwavering. "You're not the Reaper. You're my dad." He looked at the field of corpses, a testament to the monster he kept locked away. Then he looked at his daughter, alive and safe beside him. He gave a single, decisive nod. Hector straightened, his old bones groaning in protest. He helped Harriet up, her weight leaning heavily against him. They stood together, two survivors on a field of ash, and surveyed the wreckage. His land was gone. His quiet life was gone. Everything he had built to escape his past, to build a wall between Hector and the Reaper, was a smoking ruin. But Harriet was alive, and as he looked at her, determined, grease-smudged face, he knew that was enough. That was everything. Their foundation was never the farm, never the fields of corn or the old barn. It was each other. In the tattered rim, a foundation like that was more than enough to build a new home stronger than the last. He took the first step, then another, supporting her, carrying them both away from the flames and toward the dawn. They stopped on a small, untouched rise overlooking what was left of their valley. He gently set her down, and they sat together in silence as the planet's twin suns crested the hills, bathing the smoldering wreckage in the clean, unforgiving light of a new day. The air was thick with the ghosts of smoke and ozone. Harriet winced as she shifted, her gaze sweeping over the field of mangled alien technology and the blackened skeleton of their home. "Well," she said, her voice raspy but laced with a familiar, unbreakable sarcasm, "guess I'm gonna need a bigger persuader." Hector followed her gaze, his own eyes lingering on the shattered husk of the juggernaut, its metal hide rent and scorched. The general's mind automatically began to tally the cost, assess the damage, plan the defense. But then he looked at his daughter, her face smudged with soot and grit, her eyes bright with a fire the enemy fleet couldn't extinguish. The farmer returned. The father took over. "You did good, Harriet," he said, the words quiet but carrying the weight of 2 decades of unspoken pride. "That shot, the specialist in the stealth field, I never saw him." "Always got your back, old man," she whispered, echoing her words from the heart of the battle. He gave a slow nod, a finality in the gesture. He had spent half his life as a weapon and the other half trying to bury it. Now he saw. The weapon and the farmer were the same man, and both existed for this, for her. The past was no longer a ghost to be outrun, but a tool to be wielded. He turned his gaze from the wreckage to the horizon. "They burned the topsoil," he said, his voice losing its battlefield rasp and finding the familiar cadence of the land. "But the bedrock's still here." Harriet's eyes lit up, the engineer within her seeing not a graveyard of scrap, but a mine of raw materials. She pointed a shaky, grease-stained finger at the bisected marauder skiff. "That thing's got a military-grade fusion core. Leaking, sure, but I can patch it. Bet I can rig it to power the deep well pump. And the beast's chassis is solid tungsten carbide. That's the new foundation right there." Hector looked at her, then back at the ruins, and for the first time since the scarn landed on his corn, a genuine smile touched his lips. The general saw a battlefield. The farmer saw a ruined harvest. But his daughter, his brilliant daughter, saw a parts list. They had come with dreadnoughts and armies to extinguish a single life. They thought they were burning down a lonely little farm at the edge of nowhere. But out of the bloody rim, there is a simple truth known to every soul who has ever watched a human turn a junkyard into a home. You cannot kill, ruin, or discourage them by taking their things. Humans do amazing things with a plowed field and a pile of scrap. They build a home.